Well, one Easter morning, well, let's make it Easter afternoon, since they should have been in church on Easter morning. But one Easter afternoon, a father was giving his son some driving lessons. And they were cruising out through the country at about 55 miles an hour and not a care in the world. And all of a sudden, this rabbit jumps out in the middle of the road. And the son swerves the car and shouts out, "Oh my gosh, I've almost wrecked Easter. I almost killed the Easter bunny." Without even a single thought, the father just said, "It's okay, son. You missed it by a hair." Really? There's only so many good preacher jokes. That probably wasn't one of them, but I'm just saying. Well, there's all kinds of symbols for Easter, aren't there? There's Easter bunnies and chocolate and Reese's peanut butter eggs. Those are probably pretty good. Peeps and, well, I always was amazed by the artificial grass myself. But anyway, there's all kinds of symbols to Easter. And the church is no different. And one of the most amazing symbols to me, and a lot of people wear one around their neck, is the wooden cross. For Christians, this is the most powerful symbol of Easter. And why do you think it's the most powerful? You probably know the answer. It's a rhetorical question. If you notice, Protestant denominations and non-denominational Christians, the cross is empty, right? Jesus is not on this cross. In some Christian circles, Jesus remains on the cross as a sign of the crucifixion. But today we celebrate the resurrection of our Lord. He's no longer on the cross. He's no longer in the tomb. He's alive. Christ is risen.
Christ is risen indeed.
All right, you got to pay attention for the cues. But what amazes me is this about this cross and about the fact that we wear it is what it symbolized when Jesus went to that cross. In the beginning of our service, we heard the account of Jesus being arrested and brought before the chief priests and before Pilate, and then being hung on the cross and then dying on the cross. You know one thing about Easter, folks? You can't have a resurrection without a death. Many of us want to just skip all the nasty stuff, all the stuff that makes us feel uncomfortable, and jump right to the party. But there's no party without Jesus paying our debt on a cross. There is no celebration. And we're reminded of that when we look at the cross, small or big. But we're also reminded of what that cross symbolized in the time that Jesus took up that cross. The Roman government were experts at making examples out of people who didn't pay attention to their rules and their laws, to their precepts. The Roman government, the officials, were experts in execution. And not execution in the way we might think of it through lethal injection or some other means that's far more humane. No, they chose the cross for its brutality, its humiliation, the fact that there was suffering and pain, and that those who saw those who had been sentenced to the cross knew if you betray or go against the Roman government, this is going to happen to you. That's the cross. And on that Good Friday, Jesus hung on that cross as a symbol to all. Don't betray the government. Don't lift yourself up as a king above the Roman king and ruler. Because if you do, this is what awaits. So we go through that and we remember the pain and the humiliation and the suffering of Jesus. We remember the words maybe that of Isaiah, who said, "By his stripes we are healed." We remember The overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God that's symbolized on a cross. But that's half the story, right? The other half of the story begins in Luke 24, as Susan read. And Jesus has already died on the cross. His body has been taken down and set into an empty tomb by an admirer who refused to be silent any longer. It was the first day of the week. It was now the morning of the third day following Jesus' death. You know, this is probably one of the most brilliant passages of Scripture. It might seem strange about a tomb being so special, but it's so skillfully written by Luke. There's emotion, and there's movement, and there's tension. There's all these things going on in the background of this short passage. And it has a beginning and an end, like most stories do, but here's where Luke really distinguishes himself in this passage. If you were listening closely this morning, you heard that Luke began with an end. The cross, the death. And he ends with a beginning. The empty tomb. Well, Luke begins to tell us about a group of women who were convinced that this was the end. These women had dared to believe that Jesus was who he said he was, the Son of God, the Messiah, the Anointed One. And they were fully committed to his mission. Although they didn't understand it fully, they were fully committed. They believed that Jesus had come to change things. They believed that he would bring them closer to God. They had sat under his feet and were just in awe of his inspired teaching as he taught the crowds and his disciples. They were marveled by stories about how God is like a father to us. That a father that just wants nothing else but for the prodigal son to return home. They were marveled by the stories and the experiences they had where Jesus healed the sick and set others free from the power of Satan in their lives. One of the women that Luke mentions, Mary Magdalene, knew that firsthand. She'd experienced that kind of freedom and liberation. And they sensed that Jesus was different. He wasn't just any ordinary person. He wasn't just a good guy or a great teacher or a healer. But he had respect for all people, regardless of their nationality, regardless of their social class, regardless of their gender. Jesus had compassion and mercy and loved all equally, regardless. And so what else was there to do but to devote their lives and to use their possessions to help Jesus' cause? But then they watched him die. There was nothing good about that Friday for them. For them, it was the end. Now imagine, if you will, maybe you got a sense as we went through those first passages and heard the music play. And, were you there especially maybe? Maybe you can imagine for yourselves what those women must have been feeling during that time, during that morning. Now try to forget that you've heard this story before and you know how it ends and what's about to happen. Just erase Easter for a moment from your mental calendar. And think back to that early morning as these broken-hearted women went to the tomb. They believed that Jesus would be there. The man that they had placed their hopes in, that they had loved so dearly and deeply. We can't be too critical because we have to remember how frightening it would have been for those first witnesses, those women who ran to the tomb. We have to remember that despite it all, even all the emotions swirling within them, the fact that they thought it was over, they still felt compelled to go on a mission of love. As heartbroken as they were, they wanted to do one final act of devotion and love for Jesus. One final gesture of respect to honor him. He'd been buried quickly quickly because it was the Sabbath, so they wrapped the body and put some spices, but it hadn't been complete. They were trying to get Jesus in the tomb before the Sabbath began. But this time, the women were determined to take their time and to give him the full ritual that he deserved, the full honor he deserved. And so at dawn on the first day of the week, they set out for the tomb. Who were these women? Luke named some of them for us. Mary Magdalene, remember, she was the one that was set free from 7 demons. There was Mary, the mother of James the Less. Now, James the Less doesn't mean he was lesser. It just is a distinction between John's brother, James. And there was Joanna. She was the wife of an official in Herod's court. She may have even been healed by Jesus, and that's how she began following him. But I know one thing. She used what she had, her resources, her personal wealth, to support Jesus. And some scholars even believe that Joanna is the source for all that we are hearing in this passage today. And then there were others that Luke doesn't name for whatever reasons. I think we can all sympathize with the women of this story as they walked to the tomb that morning and the reality of what had happened weighing so heavily upon them. Maybe they resolved to do their best to keep Jesus' name alive for however long it would take, but they knew deep in their hearts that, well, we're going to visit the dead, and in a couple of generations it'll all probably be forgotten. Well, they may have had them thoughts, but we also know that they had practical concerns. Who was going to move this massive stone in front of the tomb that morning? Who was going to help them in their preparations of Jesus' body? But when they get to the tomb, something amazing is discovered, isn't it? That rock's already been moved. It's already gone. And so now Jesus' body wasn't there. So now Luke ends the story by telling us a group of women who were told about a new beginning. 3 times in his writings he talks about suddenly 3 men appeared in the transfiguration and the ascension, and then once again here, 2 men in dazzling clothes who were angels. Maybe Luke is trying to help us remember back to the shepherds who were frightened in the field, who saw the angels appear to them with the good news. And that's what he's trying to connect the dots with here. The announcement comes. Why do you seek the living among the dead? He's not here, but is risen. The announcement begins with the kind of heavenly logic. If you're looking for Jesus, the cemetery isn't the place to begin. It was an astounding announcement, no doubt. Jesus, the one who had been crucified, was alive. Before they could fully grasp that news, the angels go to them and explain what the problem is, why they didn't get it. You see, here's the heart of the message today. They hadn't been listening. And so the angels, in a gentle reminder, say this. Remember what he told you back in Galilee, that the Son of Man must be betrayed into the hands of sinful men and crucified, and that on the 3rd day he would rise again? They did remember after the angels reminded them. And it all made sense. So they hurried back to the 11 and the others, and they told them the good news, the great news. They told them, and you know what? They didn't believe it. The 11 and the apostles didn't believe it. Why? Because they didn't listen. They actually thought it sounded like pure nonsense, as the scriptures tell us. Now, there's a couple of good logical reasons why that would have happened. And I don't want to make too big of a deal of it, but if you've studied the Bible at all, you know that women in that time, in that culture, didn't have a very high place. They were considered second class and unreliable witnesses. A woman couldn't even testify in a court of law. So despite Jesus' example of treating women with respect, the disciples were still reluctant to accept the good news of their report. I guess ultimately those disciples hadn't listened to Jesus either. Well, ironically, this becomes sort of a way to verify that the resurrection really took place. Because let's face it, if you were going to tell the story of Jesus, you would want to make it as credible and as powerful as possible. You wouldn't choose a group of people that others looked down on if you were going to convince the world that Jesus was alive. But it's that very fact that makes it truthful and has such a key role. Each of the gospel writers presents women as the first to hear and to share the good news of the resurrection, which again gives credibility to the story that it really did happen just the way it's recorded. Now there's a second reason why they rejected what the women said is insignificant or is pure nonsense. Let's face it, Father Time is undefeated, folks, right? He's never lost a battle. Eventually, we all grow old and death happens. Everybody dies. It's just common sense, and dead people just don't come back from the dead, despite all those paranormal shows on weird cable channels. Death is a permanent thing. Death is the last enemies, and cemeteries testify to it all the time, all around the world. In the minds of the disciples, it had to sound like nonsense. Death had claimed another victim. That victim was Jesus. Well, remember, the apostles hadn't listened. And those three apostles had seen and witnessed the transfiguration, and they saw Christ in his glory, and they heard a voice from heaven say these words, "This is my Son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him." And Luke brackets the transfiguration with Jesus' warnings about his death. And the apostles didn't listen to the women because they didn't listen to Jesus. But remember how Luke writes this story? Remember how it turns out? Luke concludes his story with the beginning. Soon the disciples would be convinced with many infallible proofs that Jesus had defeated death. It would be the beginning of a new way about thinking about God in the future. It'd be a new beginning of Christ's people carrying on the work of Jesus Christ. Luke's story might not be as exciting as some of the other post-resurrection stories, but it gives us an important lesson. And here's where you need to tune in. Doubt, despair, and confusion are the results when we don't listen to Jesus. Doubt, despair, and confusion are the results when we don't listen to Jesus. Now, listening is a pretty tough thing. You can ask my girlfriend Tam. All the time, we'll be doing something at the house. She'll be over and cooking dinner or whatever, kind of just busy and distracted, and she'll say, "Tom, you haven't heard a word I say." And the routine is always the same. And I'm sure that I missed a lot of parts, but I'll say, "Yeah, you said you did this at work, and you're going here, and you're doing this, and you're going that." But the reality is, and I've been accused before, I'm sure it's only half true, that I half listen. You're nodding. Amen. Well, it's tough to listen sometimes, and some of us don't do it very well. So we shouldn't be too hard on those apostles or the women or anybody else who may not have caught the whole Easter story and may not have listened and understood that everything was leading up to that moment. Because sometimes we don't listen very well either, do we? We need to remember that. On this Easter morning, we need to remember and listen in to the words of Jesus. When we turn on the news and it seems like the world's going, you know where, handbasket, we need to listen to the words of Jesus who said, "Do not let your hearts be troubled." When bitterness and anger consumes our inner selves, and all we want to do is lash out in revenge and get even with folk, we need to listen to the words of Jesus. Forgive your enemies. Pray for them. When the challenges of life threaten to crush us and beat us down, when we feel that we can't even face one more day or one more time of taking care of a loved one, we need to remember and listen to the words of Jesus. Come to me, all you who are heavy burdened, and I will give you rest. When we worry that following Jesus might cost us our friends or other important relationships in our lives, we have to listen and remember the words of Jesus. I assure you that everyone who has given up brothers, sisters, mother, father, and children for my sake will receive now in return 100 times as many brothers, sisters, mothers, children, even in the midst of trial. When we think and complain that life's just meaningless and it has no purpose, we need to listen to the words of Jesus. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you. When we grieve over the loss of a loved one who's meant so much to us, we need to remember and listen to the words of Jesus. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And when we shudder in the face of our own mortality, we need to listen to the words of Jesus, who said, I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me will live, even though they die. For those who live and believe in me will never die. Folks, it's Easter. Are you listening?